All right, we're joined by Bruce Spiva. He's running for Attorney General in Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
All right, well, let's begin here. I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself to the folks out there. So take a moment and tell us about yourself.
Well, my name is Bruce Spiva. I've been practicing law for for 30 years, I should say. Actually, the reunion that I missed a few days ago was my 30th reunion, practicing in the areas of civil rights, consumer protection, fighting for voting rights and housing justice, and as well as commercial litigation. Before I left to run for office, I was the managing partner of the DC office of Perkins Coie, a large national law firm, and I also was a member of the firm's executive committee, which is the governing body of the firm. It has over 1,200 lawyers and about $1 billion in revenue. So I'm running because I really want to try to use the experience that I've had to try to help people, particularly low-income folks, folks who've been left out and left behind.
And I want to talk to you more about that. Talk about how your background sets you apart and makes you a good fit for this job.
I think a couple of things. One, I think that the breadth and depth of my public interest litigation experience, having litigated many cases involving civil rights, housing discrimination, fighting for tenants in Columbia Heights who had been pushed out of their housing by slumlords who had deliberately allowed their properties to go down, fighting for issues such as DC statehood. I've done that in and out of the courtroom. I am the only candidate who's actually been arrested in an act of civil disobedience, I'll hasten to add, fighting for statehood, which I think is an important issue and has, in addition to being morally correct, it has a lot of practical impact on many aspects of our city and of the job of the Attorney General. I also have, as I mentioned a minute ago, the management experience to be an effective leader of this office of over 700 professionals and almost 350 attorneys with 11 different divisions spanning everything from zoning to housing to antitrust to consumer protection. And like I said, many of those areas are areas that I have actually practiced in myself.
All right, in the national capital region, let's get into crime. We've seen a spike in crime in this area, especially in D.C. when it comes to offenses involving young people. What are your plans as Attorney General with what you can do? What are your plans there to try to help with this?
Yes, well, and the DC Attorney General, as you kind of alluded to, only has jurisdiction over juvenile crime. The office does not have jurisdiction over adult felonies. I think that is something that needs to change, that we should have jurisdiction over adult felonies. In terms of our youth, I think we want to provide the types of services and conditions that keep our youth from getting into trouble in the first place. Things like mental health counseling. Our youth are going through so much trauma these days, and particularly over the last couple of years of the pandemic. Substance abuse counseling, doing everything we can to keep our youth in school, because one of the biggest predictors of our children getting into trouble is when they are chronically absent from school. Working on housing stability issues, which will be a big priority for me, because one major source of trauma for young people is housing instability, getting kicked out of your home. And so we want to do those things. And I want to work collaboratively with other parts of the city government to try to make a real improvement in those issues, to try to keep our kids from getting into trouble in the first place. If they do get into trouble, as they no doubt sometimes will, we need to also provide those same types of wraparound services to try to get them back on the right track. There's got to be accountability for sure. But even as we are holding children accountable when we're talking about serious crimes here, we also need to remember that they are children and that we ultimately want to get them back on the right track and out of a pattern or a life of criminal activity.
All right, and let's turn to traffic safety with what you have the ability to do in the office. What are some of your ideas there? Because we've seen a lot more uh, accidents involving pedestrians, and we just had a 9-year-old who succumbed to his injuries after months of fighting for his life. So, we see these tragic stories time and time again. What are your thoughts there and your plans?
Yeah, I so agree. I mean, that was such a tragic situation. I had read about that, and that has followed on many others, unfortunately, in our city. And first and foremost, we need to enforce the law. I mean, too many of our fellow citizens are not observing just basic safety requirements, speed limit, observing stop signs, observing red lights. Simple courtesy in terms of sharing the road with bicyclists. And so I believe that firmly that we need to enforce the law on that. And in some places, we may need to even advocate for stricter penalties, or at least stricter restrictions in terms of speed limits and the like in certain areas of the city. I think education has got to play a role because I think some people commit these traffic offenses unthinkingly. That's just a pattern they've gotten into, and I think we need to educate people about the real danger and the consequences. I don't think there are many people out there who want to, get into these kinds of accidents where they're hitting a pedestrian or potentially killing a pedestrian. But I think people sometimes unthinkingly speed and don't observe basic traffic laws. And so we need to do a better job, I think, of educating people about the real harm that occurs when they do that.
They're controversial, but speed cameras, do you think that's an option here to help and to continue with?
Yes, I support it. I think that one problem we have is we haven't been able to get Maryland and Virginia to reciprocate with the tickets that we issue when the driver is from Maryland or Virginia. And so I think I want to work on trying to get a reciprocal agreement with them. That's another practical example of the problem of not having statehood, because they don't fully respect our autonomy because we are not a state. But we can try to work on that even short of statehood. We can try to work on getting a reciprocal agreement, perhaps even booting cars that have been repeat offenders and haven't paid their fines. But I do think that that is one good tool to try to slow people down, try to get them to observe stop signs.
All right. Well, let's turn to your predecessor. If you were to be elected here, he's gone after a lot of big companies: Facebook, Amazon, the Trump administration. Very high profile cases that you saw Carl Racine announce from his office. Where do you stand on these types of high profile cases? And is that something you'd like to continue if you were elected?
Well, I formed my own firm, Mike, at one time here in the district to focus on consumer and antitrust class actions, as well as civil rights work. And so I have a long history of experience going after companies that either unscrupulously defraud consumers or that engage in anti-competitive behavior that harms consumers. I've represented numerous classes of district residents who've been harmed by such activity. So I'm well prepared by experience to be able to pursue such cases where it's warranted. And my guiding standard would be: have residents of the District of Columbia been harmed by a practice of a company? And if so, do we have a path to hold them accountable under the law? And if we do, I would pursue such a case. And I'm the best prepared in terms of the candidates in the race to be able to do that effectively, because I've done it over many years. I wouldn't comment on a specific case, but that's pending right now. But I certainly would bring an independent eye to any major case like that is outstanding. But my presumption is that cases that have been brought by the office before I got there should continue unless I learn information that suggests to the contrary, that they lack merit somehow or some other reason. But that would be my general presumption to any case that is pending in the district.
And you talked a bit about consumer protection. That's obviously a big part of the job. What are some of your priorities in that area?
I think well, consumer protection itself is a big priority of mine, and kind of as an adjunct to that is workers' rights. Going after companies that don't pay their workers what they're required under our labor laws. That's a big problem in the district as it is elsewhere, and I'll go after that. I've represented labor unions, and I'm well prepared to do that. In terms of consumer protection, I'm particularly concerned about our seniors and these kinds of ripoff schemes that are often perpetrated by our most vulnerable people in the population. Ripoff schemes involving their home equity, ripoff schemes involving many other things as well. And so that'll be a focus of mine. I'm also concerned about, folks who or companies that go after low income people, where they call them last dollar lenders or last dollar frauds, essentially where they're trying to take the last dollar of someone who's already vulnerable. And that would certainly be a focus of mine. And again, something that I'm well prepared to do because I've done it before many times. And that's what really distinguishes me, kind of going back to your early question. People don't have to wonder whether I'm going to know how to do this, whether I'm going to be effective, whether I'm actually going to follow through on what I say I'm going to do. It's all in my DNA to be on this side of things because I've done it for 30 years. And so you don't have to just kind of take my word for it. It's not just something I'm saying because it's election season. It's something that I've committed my career to.
And Attorney General Karl Racine, when it comes to affordable housing, has taken more of an advocacy role in that area. What are your thoughts with that? Something you want to continue? And if so, what are some of your strategies there?
Yes, and again, this is here again is an area where I've had lots of experience. I've fought for tenants and won damages in a case where the slumlords had pushed them out of their housing with, unfortunately, in those days, the cooperation of the district government. So I'm prepared to hold the district government itself accountable, as I did in that case. I've fought for public housing residents. I've also litigated cases under our Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. So I'm well prepared to do this, and it would be a high priority of mine. A couple things. There are many strategies that I have in mind, but one is going after slumlords that deliberately let their buildings run down in order to push the tenants out, in order to make way for high-end condos and apartment buildings. The other thing is oftentimes developers make promises in exchange for city money to create a certain amount of affordable housing, but they don't always keep those promises. And so I would be vigilant at looking at that, working with community groups and enforcing those promises.
All right. And you led a challenge of Councilmember Kenny McDuffie's candidacy in this race, and we all know how that turned out. And it's kind of left in some experts tell me it's kind of left a cloud over the race. Do you believe so? And do you believe that could impact you since you led that challenge? Just what are your thoughts on that whole situation? What transpired?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I have said from the beginning, and I still say that Councilmember McDuffie is a dedicated public servant. So it was never a personal challenge. And I've reached out to him and to his many of his followers to try to find a way to work together because mine was strictly a challenge about eligibility requirements, certain experience requirements that the council in its wisdom and that the people through a referendum put in place. And the courts obviously, agreed with me that those weren't met here. But I think for the good of the city, we still need to come together and work together. It was never a personal statement about Councilmember McDuffie's quality as a public servant. Like I said, I think he's a good public servant. You had mentioned, I think some experts tell you that there's a lot of bitterness left over. And I've heard that too from a lot of kind of so-called experts, but that's not what I'm hearing out in the community. I've spent lots of time, particularly east of the river in Ward 5. And I'm hearing a lot of people who are ready to come together and who are drawn to my message of fighting for those who've been left out and left behind. I share a lot of the priorities of Councilmember McDuffie in terms of criminal justice reform. And I also bring to the table the experience we just talked about in terms of fighting for workers' rights and consumer protection. And so even among those who previously supported Councilmember McDuffie, I'm finding a lot of people are very receptive to my message and my experience. And so I think the experts are wrong in this instance.
And you and your challengers share a lot of ideas where you agree on a lot of different things. So what sets you apart from your challengers? You know, as the voters decide, you know, they're trying to figure out who they like the most. What sets you apart?
Two major things. One is my long-standing history in the fight for statehood. And I think that's so important. Obviously, as a moral case, we pay higher taxes than anybody in the nation, and we have no say. We fought in every war, and we have no say in our federal government, and the federal government often does interfere with our own local laws. And so there's a moral case there, but even more so, there are a lot of practical reasons why we need this. I mean, we are down about a third of our judges in our local courts because the Senate has to confirm them. And you can imagine what that does to things like juvenile justice, to be down a third of your key personnel. So it's important to have somebody in there who thinks about this issue, has fought in the trenches, and can think about ways of getting us more local autonomy, even short of statehood. Second thing is experience. There's no one in the race who can even come close to comparing the breadth and depth of experience that I have with these issues of furthering the public interest litigation, experience in areas like consumer protection and antitrust enforcement, civil rights, housing discrimination, and housing justice issues. If you look on my website, and I encourage everybody to do that, spivafordcag.com, you'll see my policies laid out. And almost every one of them has a section that says what Bruce has done, with a long list of my history of fighting for these issues. And then it says what Bruce will do, which sets forth the vision that I have for moving forward in the office going forward. And I don't think any of my competitors would be able to set forth that type of record of having fought in the trenches on these issues.
Finally, who would be your predecessor if you're elected? Carl Racine, what would you do differently? You've studied his career, you've seen his time as AG and what he's done. How would you do things differently? Or would you?
I would try to take down the temperature with the mayor, whoever the mayor is, next year. I think that there's been, and I'm sure I'm not putting this all on AG Racine, I'm sure there's plenty of fault to go around, but I don't think it's good for the city, for the attorney general and the mayor to be at such loggerheads. And so I will work very hard to try to foster a collaborative relationship, because the challenges we face, the solutions don't reside under any one roof of the government. They certainly don't all reside under the AG's office, and they don't all reside under the mayor's office and the agencies under the mayor. And so I would seek to do that. I'll protect the independence of the office. I was one of the big supporters of having an elected attorney general. I fought for that. I was among those who fought for that. The attorney general we had at the time didn't support that. And so we've got that. So I will protect the independence of the office. But I do think, to the extent we can, we need to try to come together for the good of the city. And where we have disagreements, let it be over policy and not over personality.
Bruce Spiva, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.